from Vassar College, this is Conversations at the Salt Line with Wesley Dixon.
On this episode, a conversation with Beverly Gage.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for another episode of Conversations at the Salt Line. And today we are happy to welcome a wonderful guest, Professor Beverly Gage, who is the John Lewis Gaddis Professor of History at Yale University and the author of G-Man, a biography recently written on J. Edgar Hoover. Thanks for being here, Beverly.
Thanks for inviting me.
Of course. You have done so many wonderful things. The intro could have been significantly longer, but I'm sensitive to time and don't want to have people sort of listening longer than they have to. But you have just done incredible work, not only recently with the Pulitzer Prize winning G-Men book, but many books before that and many other bodies of work. How does it feel just at this moment in your life in general to sort of be engaged in the kind of work you're doing and asking the kind of questions you're asking?
Well, I think one thing that was really heartening about the reception of G-Man, which is an 837-page book, was just to discover that there is a real place in the world for that kind of serious scholarship, that sort of length of book that apparently, at least some people still want to read 800-page studies of American history. So that was really rewarding, in part because when you're working on a project this long, I worked on this for more than a decade, you kind of wonder, as the world is getting faster paced, as everything's moving online, et cetera, is there a place in the world for that kind of intellectual work? And so it's been great to see that there really is.
That's so wonderful. And we're definitely going to get into a more robust conversation about the book in a little bit. But I wanted to sort of ask you sort of a broader question. I'm thinking about this moment we're in the country generally. And of course, you study, among other things, social movements in American history and American 20th century history. And I'm just curious, it might sound simple or funny, but how would you define a social movement? It's sort of a broad term, and I think the term might have different meaning at different points in time. So I'm curious how you define it.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I don't think there is one single accepted definition of a social movement. I think the basic idea is that you have a number of people who invest in a particular cause with a particular set of aims and who understand themselves to be engaged in some sort of common effort. But as you say, what that looks like has changed pretty dramatically, both tactically and conceptually throughout American history. One of the things that I am particularly interested in as not so much in my scholarship on Hoover, but more generally, are the ways in which social media and other modern forms of technology have changed activism and kind of movement politics, both for better and for worse. And so I think we've seen in recent years these big upsurges of activism that many ways wouldn't have been possible in their speed and in their spread before social media. But I think social media also can be a real hazard because people think, once I've said it on Twitter or Instagram, my job is done. And actually movements have tended to need really serious, long-term, multidimensional strategies throughout history to get anything done.
Yeah, it's so funny hearing you say that, and I hope some of our students or recent alum hear you because, of course, and this is not unique to our students now. This is probably something that many students over many years have had to sort of learn. But of course, activism is many things, right? And it takes many people playing many different roles, doing different things to sort of create this larger ecosystem of activism. But I think oftentimes, to your point, because of social media, we some of us have become conditioned to understand activism as looking a certain kind of way. And it has to be sort of palatable or consumable in a certain way for us to codify it as activism. And that's probably just not historical or true.
One of the ways that I met Betsy Bradley, your president, was through our common work in the Grand Strategy program here at Yale, which is a pretty small and focused program that initially was about foreign policy strategy, but Betsy and I worked together to kind of broaden the definition of what grand strategy or strategy might actually be and who it would be useful to. And that was partly coming out of precisely what you say, right? A sense that campus activism in particular had been going in a very specific direction, which is sort of a performative direction, right? Highly individualized, about self-presentation, about signaling your affinities online and in the way that you move through the world, but that lacked so many of the elements that make for actual political and social success. And so grand strategy is the idea that you start out by thinking, where do we want to be over the long term, right? What's the big goal? And then what are the range of tools that are available to us to get there? What are the strengths? What are the weaknesses? What's the relationship between the means and the ends? That might mean electoral strategies. It might mean social media. It might mean protest. It might mean legal strategies. It might mean, a big strategy for changing the courts themselves, right? And all of these things matter, and you have to think about them together as opposed to just rely on one tool, because then you're kind of doing yourself in.
Hamstrung. Yeah, exactly.
Exactly.
It's funny as we think about social movements. Maybe I'm showing my bias, but of course the term social movements to me, again, this is probably just because of my own orientation, has a progressive bend to it, if you will. But as we're talking, I'm recognizing like it's not really true, right? And there are social movements that are certainly not quote unquote progressive. I'm originally from Florida. And so I'm thinking about sort of the social movements around, banning certain kinds of education in the state of Florida, or certain kinds of politics, i.e. DEI is a general sort of politic in public higher education. Can you reflect or talk about sort of how we can come to think about these kinds of social movements that are not progressive, and how we sort of, just understand them, given sort of the bias that we think about coming with social movements as a term?
That's a lot of what my teaching, and to some degree my research, has been about, is kind of the conservative side of the spectrum. And that ranges from very elite figures like J. Edgar Hoover on down to really grassroots initiatives, right? The modern conservative movement that swirled around figures like William F. Buckley, the modern anti-abortion movement, the religious right? All of these you would understand in some sense as social movements. And as with most social movements, you see a range of actors, right? You see intellectuals, you see politicians, you see grassroots actors, you see, housewives in places like Orange County who really were, the pioneers in many ways of the mid-century conservative movement. And so I think it's certainly a concept that can be applied to the right, and in fact has been one of the drivers of our modern politics. You can think about a figure like Trump, for instance, as being, on the one hand, a very singular individual, right? A kind of cult of personality. And if he hadn't come along, I think our politics would look very different. But on the other hand, he is also channeling and is the product of a whole set of movements that have been going on for, in most cases, something like 30, 40, 50 years at this point.
Yeah, we had, I don't know if you know this person, we had a woman named Elise Hogue on the podcast maybe a couple months ago, and she was a longtime CEO of this advocacy group called NARAL Pro-Choice. It was a sort of obviously a pro-choice group, but she wrote this book, The Lie That Binds, and it's about sort of this very well-crafted, well-researched sort of social movement on the right to sort of make abortion an issue where it had not been before, sort of in those political circles. And it was such a great example of sort of, to your point, the grand strategy that group or that political sort of organization, broadly defined, used to sort of move over a series of decades, individuals, people, corporations. So it was really helpful to see that example. And it sort of helped me think about social movements, to your point, as not sort of baked in one sort of political party or ideology, but rather they're sort of they span the gamut, if you will. So it's helpful to have that example. You mentioned presidential politics briefly at the mention of Trump, and I wanted to sort of just ask you to reflect on an experience you had. I understand earlier this year in January of 24, you had the opportunity to sit with some other colleagues of yours, historians, at the White House with President Biden and I imagine other advisors of his, to talk about sort of where we are as a country, and sort of ground that maybe in some historical frameworks and thinking. Can you just reflect on that experience? I mean, it's not every day that someone gets to sit in the White House and talk to the president about the work they do. So I'm curious what it was like for you, sort of personally, professionally, but also sort of where you think, how you think about that meeting in the context of a larger sort of American ecology, political ecology.
Well, I think that meeting, which of course was rather thrilling for me, it was me and 5 other historians and a few advisors and the president meeting for, I think in the end it was about 2 or 3 hours together. This was in early January and was intended to serve, I think, really 2 purposes. One was at the start of a new year, at the start of a campaign year, to really take stock of where we stand in history at this moment, how it relates to certain things that have happened in the American past, how we might be experiencing things that are legitimately new. And then it was also more specifically sort of a brainstorming session in anticipation of the speech that Biden gave at the end of that week at Valley Forge about January 6th. That was in many ways kind of the launch of his overt campaign against Trump, but also was a really searching historical understanding and examination of where political violence fits into American history. It was January 6th, unprecedented in some way. And I think what was really interesting was that one of the powerful themes that came out of that conversation was the need for kind of liberals and the left to have a really powerful, coherent, and simple story about what the United States that they believe in, that they're fighting for, that they understand. What does that look like? What is our American history story that we can tell that is an appealing story, a meaningful story that at the same time doesn't gloss over, right, all of the great injustices and difficulties of the American past? So that's what we talked about quite a lot. It's something that I care a lot about. I think that we are in a moment where the right has in some ways captured patriotism, has captured a very simple story about the United States, right? Make America great again, right? It's a slogan, but they have a powerful, simple image. And we know what is the America that they care about, that they stand for. And I think it's much more diffuse. A lot of, leftists and liberals don't like to talk about patriotism, don't actually even want to talk about American history as anything other than, a parade of oppression. And all of that is powerful and real. And I'm a historian, right? And so this is a lot of what we care about. But I think we're in a difficult moment around that. And so it was really exciting to be able to hash some of that out, in the Oval Office of all places.
It's so interesting to hear you say that because, of course, what I'm hearing you say as you're reflecting on this, particularly sort of the narratives that at least political parties might be utilizing to sort of reach their goals, is that at least on the left, there is what I'm hearing you say in part, or the subtext of it is there is not sort of a cohesive integration of the variety of histories that make up American history beyond sort of this very, I don't want to call it absolutist, but a very sort of I don't want to call it extreme either, but a very singular, particular perspective of American history that has sort of taken hold, if you will. And I think you're right that for many people, that doesn't always resonate. And it is not the history that they lived, believe in, or also one that motivates them. And so to sort of have a history that is honest and true and inclusive of those things, but also inclusive of other components, I think is a really worthwhile task. One that's hard, obviously, because we're holding different things in our brains at one time, right? And it's hard to sort of tell a singular story because, of course, it isn't, right? It's not a singular story, but I think it is one that rings true to more people. So I think I'm happy to hear you say that because I think many people might really internalize that as something that's a helpful way to think about American history, but also their lives, right? Because our lives are not singular either. As much as we want them to be, they're oftentimes very complicated. And so it can be a good practice to tell our own history and others' history in the way that you've described.
And if you look at social movements in the past, right, what we were just talking about, many of them have dealt with this. This is in some ways new and acute in our own moment. But a lot of left social movements over history have actually pretty effectively negotiated making a set of claims about the promise of the United States, what that original set of claims about equality actually stood for, taking meaning out of that, while also in some ways rejecting a purely national framework, in other ways, pointing out and actually organizing around the fact of exclusion. So if you look at the civil rights movement, you look at the abolition movement, you look at the women's suffrage movement, right, they actually had a pretty effective balance of kind of claiming the Declaration of Independence at the same time that they're obviously organizing around some of its flaws and exclusions and injustices.
That's super helpful to hear. Before we go into the book, I just have one other question, sort of, maybe it's a broad question just about you and your role as a historian. I'm curious if over the years of your work and your research, if you've identified, at least in American history, social movements or political history, are there some leading indicators, if you will, of critical inflection points in our society? Of course, the one that we've experienced potentially most recently is January 6th, but I'm curious if that really is a leading indicator of sorts, or if it's anomalous in ways that, we should sort of just note, but then not over-index on. I'm curious how you think about that kind of a question.
Well, I try to make pretty fine distinctions about what's new and what we have long histories of. So around something like violence, right? I mean, American history is just filled with violent conflict. And I always sort of chuckle when people say we've never been as divided as we are today. I was like, actually, we went, there was a civil war in which we killed 600,000 Americans. Actually, we've been more divided at other moments in the past. And so I try to be a little more fine-grained about that. And January 6th is a good example. There have been lots of acts of political resistance and violence, even around elections, that's a powerful strain of American history. At the same time, we actually haven't seen something like what we saw on January 6th, which is that violence being encouraged and affirmed by, a sitting president. And we haven't seen that kind of resistance to relinquishing power. And so those pieces really are new to January 6th, new to our moment. A lot of them have to do with Trump in particular, and ways that he behaved both in office and out of office.
Wonderful. So I'm going to take on the elephantine task of trying to have a meaningful conversation about the book that is over 800 pages in the next 35 minutes or so. But I know you probably are expert at this point because you've given many talks about your work in this book, but we'll try our best to sort of make it as substantive, but also efficient as possible. So one of the things that struck me as I read the book was the focus on the early years and the genesis of J. Edgar Hoover. Those who are listening that haven't read the book, J. Edgar Hoover, of course, was the longtime director of the FBI, served for 48 years, and really, as I understand it, per Professor Gage's work, really turned the FBI into what we know it as today, for the most part. And so there's many things in the book that are super interesting, but I think for me, I love storytelling broadly. And so getting a sense of the early days of J. Edgar Hoover's life and career, and then tying that or seeing it tied throughout the years of service in the FBI was super interesting. So I'm curious to start, if you can reflect on, for you, what it was like to sort of spend time working with in learning the stories of the early J. Edgar Hoover and what that did for you as you continued the project and took us through the rest of his life that people know more about generally.
It's one of the beauties of biography as a genre, right? That you get to make those kinds of connections, which in this case are both political, right, in a very expansive sense, and also deeply personal. And those are the kinds of biographies that I like to read and that I obviously also like to write, biographies that are about an individual, but really connecting that individual with some of the biggest questions of his or her life and times. So in Hoover's case, he was almost a perfect subject for studying what I wanted to take on, which is the transformation of Washington, D.C. in particular, and then of the federal government more broadly over the course of the 20th century. He was born in Washington, D.C., he died in Washington, D.C., and he entered government service very early on. And so his career is this kind of, is kind of amazing. He spent 48 years there as the head of the FBI, 55 years in total within the Justice Department. And so with Hoover, you get going into that career stuff very, very quickly, and it's all quite interesting. But as you say, one of the big questions was, who was he at that moment that he entered government service? What ideas was he bringing with him? And for me, there were two big things that came out of his childhood that I think he really carried on throughout the rest of his career. One was that partly because he was born in DC, which at the time was a place where people could not vote, and where most people were working in government rather than politics, right? He's sort of born into a tradition of professional government service that is different from politics. And he really carried that sense of professionalism and career government service and standing outside of politics into his career. And then the other is that DC shaped him in his social ideas, right? Particularly with very powerful conservative ideas about the things that were going to be his signature themes for the rest of his life. Race, DC is a segregated city, right? Anti-communism, law and order, religiosity, right? All of these things you can see kind of percolating in his childhood. In terms of the research, the thing that surprised me the most was what I discovered about his college fraternity, which was a fraternity called Kappa Alpha, and he was deeply invested in this fraternity. He was chapter president. He remained involved for most of his life, and it was an explicitly white Southern fraternity, deeply segregationist at the time that he joined. And so that was particularly interesting to explore because I could see sort of the formation of his racial ideology, which is going to be so important to the fate of so many people over the course of the 20th century.
Of course. It's so funny as I read the book and as I heard you talk about it now, the genesis of people and institutions is a very funny sort of topic, right? And of course now, particularly in many things, higher education in particular, institutions are doing versions of, exploring their archives, thinking about their own relationships to ills like slavery in America, or other kinds of things, treatments of Native American populations on their campuses, on the grounds in which they exist. And it's funny because people react very strongly to sort of, some people react very strongly to the unearthing of the genesis stories of institutions, right? Because people feel a range of things. They feel like, you're trying to guilt them, or, you are sullying sort of the narrative of otherwise very pristine institution that's now sort of doing what it should be doing. And so it was a funny experience to sort of think about the genesis of Hoover in the context of the impact he had on the FBI, which of course has impacts on many other people, right? And so I'm curious sort of how you think about generally, but also in this project, understanding someone in context, because we say that, but it's sometimes really hard to do. We didn't live in that context, right? And so we don't always know how to contextualize them. But also I'm curious if you have thoughts on the extent to which these genesis stories should influence our sense of trust or fidelity with these people or institutions today.
Well, as a historian, I don't expect perfection from people in the past, right? Any more than I expect perfection from the people around me today. And that's not to say that I can't make judgments, or that I want to make excuses for people in the past. But, I think we have to understand the human experience as something quite complicated. And within any individual, you're going to see virtues and prejudices and ambitions and cruelties, and some people more than others, right? So I guess in my own relationship to the past as a historian, I'm deeply curious about it. And I think that that is the most important thing, is just to have a sense of curiosity, having a willingness to take a leap into the minds and experiences and lives of people who are quite different from you. That's what really gets me excited. And, that's why I wrote a biography of J. Edgar Hoover, who is not someone that I particularly admire or particularly agree with on most issues. But that is kind of what fascinates me about being able to do this kind of work as a historian. So in Hoover's case, I think it's a little different from universities or something, because Hoover is unsulliable, right? Because one of the things that was sort of interesting to me about taking him on is that he had been portrayed as such a one-dimensional villain, right? In our popular culture. A lot of that has happened since the years of his death, when there have been all sorts of exposés of the truly terrible and outrageous and sometimes illegal things that the FBI did during his tenure. And I actually wanted to do a little bit of the opposite, which was not to redeem Hoover in any way, but to take him seriously as a complicated political figure, right? You don't get to spend 48 years in an appointed government job and just be a terrible, terrible person that nobody likes the whole time. Right. And one of the things that was most interesting to me was not only exploring his record, but actually the legions of people who really liked him and supported him for better or worse. And that's presidents, that's congressmen, and that is the American public at large. He was, for most of his life, one of the most popular and famous public servants in the United States. And so we think of him as this kind of horrible, friendless villain, but that's A, not true, and B, I think it kind of distorts our understanding of how that kind of power is developed and how it actually worked.
Yeah, that's super helpful. And then just to sort of put a fine point on something else, I'm curious about what is the around Hoover or otherwise, what is the practice of sort of really taking seriously the project of understanding a moment in context? And how do you sort of encourage people who may not be professional historians, but might be curious and well-intentioned citizens to be able to do that as they evaluate things that are happening in the contemporary moment?
I think it is a challenge. Yeah. But I think there are ways of making those kinds of distinctions. So, for instance, about a decade ago now, I was on a committee at Yale, mostly made up of historians, that took on the question of whether or not Yale should rename Calhoun College, which was one of its residential colleges, named after John Calhoun, who was a very prominent early 19th century political figure from South Carolina, right? Had been vice president, had all sorts of kind of high government positions, and it was partly for those reasons that Yale had named this college for Calhoun in the 30s. But of course, Calhoun is also famously the intellectual architect of defenses of slavery, overt defenses of slavery as a positive good, and of the idea of states' rights, rebellion, nullification that proved so important to the Confederacy, although he died before the Civil War. So we had to take up exactly the question that you're saying, that many universities are wrestling with, many other institutions. And in the end, we decided that Calhoun ought to be renamed. It wasn't really up to us, but we were making a pretty powerful argument for that. And that was because, on the one hand, Calhoun reflected certain, biases and prejudices that would have been very typical of the white South in
Right.
the early 19th century. But he also made a particularly unique contribution and a particularly pernicious contribution to all of that. And so we weighed kind of the totality of his career and kind of came down on the side that, it's different from, I don't know, someone was was an enslaver, right? Or a slave owner, or someone simply, reflected a lot of the ideas of their own moment, right? And I think that those distinctions are actually pretty important, thinking about the broader context and then about the individual's role in it.
That's super interesting. One of the things that stuck out to me, knowing that I'd be talking to you on this podcast as I read the book, is this concept of finding these paradoxes or these salt lines sort of in the life of someone like J. Edgar Hoover. And of course, as you said earlier, part of the mission of this biography was to sort of complicate and sort of flesh out his life in ways that maybe had not been done before. And so one of the salt lines that stuck out to me, and I would love to hear your reflections on it, is sort of this way in which J. Edgar Hoover was sort of, in some ways, really adored and loved by some progressive and liberal politicians because of his commitment to sort of civil service in the government, long sort of career civil service. But also he carried with him, as he did that, these very same conservative ideas that you highlighted earlier that came from, in large part, his childhood. And sort of, I think, as you argued, built the FBI sort of around the intersection of those sorts of personality traits and histories. And I'm just curious what it was like for you to sort of grapple with or sort of explore those kinds of mixing of ideas, this sort of compound, this cocktail, if you will, of influences that might not seem to go well together, but clearly were effective in producing something that has lasted for a very long time.
That was the real puzzle that got me interested in Hoover. On the one hand, he's a great believer in the state, professionalism, expertise, science, career government service as a noble enterprise. And I think he really did build the FBI in many ways around that set of ideas. And then he's also this deep, deep conservative, right, on many, many issues. And when I looked at both how we think about our own politics and then at the ways that historians tend to narrate American political history in the 20th century, those things just didn't seem to go together, right? We didn't have a good example of that. And so that's what I wanted to do, as you say, was to kind of put those ideas together to get away from our, sort of 21st century understandings that conservatives are anti-statist in some way, right? They hate the federal government. And to look at this federal bureaucrat who was a hero of the conservative movement, who was a hero to many people on the right, even as he himself was often trying to draw distinctions between what was a legitimate right wing and what he considered to be beyond the pale. So that was really the puzzle that drew me into it. It was the thing that fascinated me most about Hoover. And then I would say, one of the other, I guess, not exactly paradoxes, but sense of kind of intertwinedness that really interested me was to think about the relationship between very elite political actors, people with lots of power in Washington, and the fate and experiences of ordinary citizens. And Hoover is also really a great example of that, of the ways in which, kind of ordinary politics on the ground, social movements are shaping what's happening at the FBI, what's possible, what's not possible. And then I think more importantly, the ways in which state power, and particularly surveillance, investigation, disruption, all of the things that the FBI was engaged in, was profoundly shaping what was possible for left movements mostly, but also for right-wing movements to some degree on the ground throughout this period. So I think you can't understand the civil rights movement without understanding the FBI. You can't understand the labor movement without understanding the FBI. You can't understand student activism in the 60s and 70s without understanding the FBI. And so I wanted to get at those intersections and look at the ways they were kind of shaping each other.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I want to spend a little bit of time on the civil rights movement in a little bit, but on this point of sort of Hoover himself being this sort of intermixing, to use your word, of a number of different things. One of the other things that I've heard you say, and it was shown in the book too, about Hoover, is that he had this interesting way of, I don't want to say bringing together, that sounds much more like rosy than I think it is, but he sort of minimize the distance between political figures who otherwise we might have thought about as being diametrically opposed. The example I'm thinking about is LBJ and Nixon, right? Who we think about as distinctly different presidential figures, but who both, per your work, had very strong relationships to Hoover, right? And in some ways, Hoover, I don't want to describe him as the bridge between them, but there was sort of this commonality in ways that if you put Hoover in the equation, again, they seem much less different than they might seem otherwise. I'm curious if you can reflect on that insight that you made as you wrote the book and sort of what we can learn from someone playing that sort of role that Hoover played relative to these two elite political figures.
During Hoover's 48 years as FBI director, he served under 8 presidents. 4 of them were Democrats and 4 of them were Republicans. So for us, this seems almost impossible.
Right.
But there's something as a result that's really interesting to think about and to explain about that. And I think he had a sort of interesting combination of certain core ideas and values that we've talked about that are incredibly consistent over his lifetime, and then incredible flexibility in judging what it is that particularly presidents in the White House want him to do and the causes and purposes that they want him to serve. 2 of the most interesting of those relationships, as you say, were Lyndon Johnson and Richard Nixon. We think of Johnson, the great liberal, Nixon, the kind of backlash president. And Hoover had deep and lasting relationships with both of them. With Johnson, they had been neighbors on the same block in Washington beginning in the 1940s. Yeah. So they knew each other pretty well. They both liked the kind of backroom, power plays that are so important in Washington. And they both hated the Kennedys. So they were already pretty well bonded by the time Johnson became president. And one of the things that was really fascinating to me about Lyndon Johnson is that he looked at this, crotchety old conservative, right? By the time Johnson's coming into the White House, Hoover is approaching the mandatory federal retirement age of 70. And the first thing that Johnson does almost as president is say, Edgar, we're going to keep you on. You don't need to retire. Let's do this thing together. And then he goes on to make use of Hoover in all of these pretty dramatic ways, some of which are very powerful and I would say admirable. He really pushes the FBI into civil rights enforcement. And then on the other hand, he is using Hoover for all sorts of kind of pernicious purposes at the same time to spy on and infiltrate and disrupt civil rights activists, to do a whole bunch of political favors that are really pretty outrageous and things that the FBI shouldn't be doing. So that's a fascinating relationship in its own right. And then comes Nixon, and Nixon says, hey, I also love J. Edgar Hoover. They also had been friends since the 1940s. And, Nixon actually says that he considers J. Edgar Hoover his closest political friend in Washington. There's this fascinating moment when Johnson is getting ready to leave office. Nixon is coming in. When they get together, and Johnson says to Nixon, it's going to turn out that Edgar is the only person you can trust in Washington. So he's the man you can rely on. And Nixon says, great, I totally agree. They both call J. Edgar Hoover. They chat with him on the phone. And, who else is being called, by these 2 very different men and very different presidents?
It's so interesting to hear you describe him as strategically flexible, sort of depending on sort of who was in the seat of the White House at whatever given time. It's a funny way of framing it, and it makes sense. And it also makes me wonder, sort of if he was really being instrumentalized or if it was the other way around. And if the presidents themselves didn't quite recognize that he was such a sort of adept career civil servant, and sort of knew sort of the power he had in ways that, to your point, allowed him to sort of, in aggregate, actually enact an agenda of his own as opposed to enacting others' agenda over a period of time. Who will ever know? But it's a curious question when you think about the skills he had and how he operated across a range of different people over a period of time.
Yeah, he was very flexible in the sense that, when a new crisis came along, and this was particularly true in the 1930s, right? A new crisis comes along. There's John Dillinger and gangsters, right, shooting up American cities. Franklin Roosevelt says, Edgar, can you do this? Can you deal with this? And he says, sure. And he decides that he's going to train all of these white collar agents who really hadn't been, full law enforcement agents up to that point.
Right.
He says, sure, I'm going to teach them to shoot guns. We're going to carry guns. We're going to go after the gangsters. A few years later, World War II comes along, and Franklin Roosevelt turns to J. Edgar Hoover and says, hey, we need an intelligence service. Can you take charge of, surveillance, espionage, counterinsurgency, all of these things? And Hoover says, sure, we can do that. And he reformulates his bureaucracy again. So he's very, very smart about responding to those things and about responding to kind of favors that presidents wanted. At the same time, right, there is famously a lever, more than one, that he's holding over presidents, right? He knows an awful lot about both the occupants of the White House and many other political actors in Washington. There's a lot of fear about what Hoover knows, and if you go up against him, what he's going to do with that. And then perhaps more interestingly, they're also deeply aware of his popularity and his very devout political constituency, both within the government and then within the American grassroots. And he was very smart about cultivating the press, cultivating grassroots organizations like the American Legion or the Daughters of the American Revolution. And so I think there was a deep awareness, particularly in those later years, of Hoover's power, of his viciousness if you went against him. So it's a combination of he was the indispensable man, and also you didn't want to go up against him if you
Absolutely. Absolutely. I want to go back to LBJ as an example that you highlighted a little bit earlier. One of the things that you hinted at, but I want to make it more explicit, is the ways in which LBJ sort of worked with Hoover to do a number of potentially contradictory things, right, around civil rights. Of course, the first thing I'm thinking about is the way in which Hoover worked to help is not quite the right word, but sort of help implement and enact the Civil Rights Act, if you will, on the ground. I'm thinking of the example of him opening up the field office in Jackson, and which had not been done, Jackson, Mississippi, which had not been done before, which, if you would take in the most generous interpretation, was a really well-intentioned, meaningful sort of like investment of people and infrastructure in a place that needed it in terms of civil rights. At the same time, as you hinted at earlier, there were these consistent ways that LBJ was, at the very least, I understand, supportive of or encouraging of monitoring, surveillance, sort of, to use your word, pernicious sort of oversight of people like MLK, Malcolm X, in ways that probably flew in the face of civil rights sort of enactment, or sort of left questions around maybe how authentic the White House was in their efforts to support and encourage civil rights. And it just struck me as a very interesting combination of things, right? It's sort of, if you read at its face, it might seem like it's just sort of a duplicitous government sort of effort to say we want, rights on one end, but really going to constrain them on the other end because we don't really want you to have the rights, right? And I think many people have these concerns about government even today, right? That things the government does or do are not really authentic efforts, and they're just sort of these political sort of posturing sort of exercises. I'm curious how you think about that maybe skeptical interpretation of government today, given the examples you highlight about, I guess, through Hoover and LBJ around civil rights in the 60s.
Yeah, it's a complicated story. I mean, more complicated for Johnson, I think, than for Hoover, but also somewhat complicated for
Right.
Hoover, right? If you take the summer of 1964, the sort of spring into summer of 1964, Lyndon Johnson is absolutely committed to and expends a great deal of political capital to see the Civil Rights Act come to fruition, right? He kind of stakes his presidency. He's come into the presidency because of Kennedy's assassination. He's got an election there, and he wants to make that happen, both for political reasons, but I think also for deeply held, moral uh, and personal reasons. He
Right.
wants to see the Civil Rights Act through. And he mobilizes Hoover to help him do that. And then once the Civil Rights Act is passed, he turns to Hoover and he says, look, this law has been passed, lots of violence in Mississippi in particular, and we have to show that federal power is going to enforce this new law. And Edgar, I want you personally to go to Mississippi, open a new field office in Jackson, show what, avenging federal power is going to look like, and be my ambassador. Now, it's also true he's sending Hoover there because he thinks Hoover's a pretty good ambassador to the white South. On the one hand, white Southerners kind of hate Hoover and hate the FBI because it's a federal presence and, they're doing some civil rights enforcement. On the other hand, white Southerners are like, he's really one of us.
Right.
So Johnson is sending him there for a variety of reasons. Nonetheless, there it is, and it happens. The other moment that is really fascinating to me is when Johnson makes his famous speech in early 1965, in the midst of Selma, in support of the Voting Rights Act. When he's going to make that speech, he calls J. Edgar Hoover and says, will you sit in my box for this speech? Sit next to Lady Bird Johnson, be there and show the world that we mean what we say. This is what federal power is going to be dedicated to. So we've got that. At the same time, Johnson, when the Democratic National Convention comes along in August of 1964, the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party is coming up from Mississippi to try to dislodge the all-white Mississippi delegation. What does Johnson do? He calls on the FBI and says, I want you to spy on every civil rights activist at this convention and to give me reports about what we're doing.
Right.
Purely political intelligence, right? Absolutely not something that the FBI should have been engaged in, but they do it. And Johnson knows all about their surveillance of Martin Luther King, right? All of those outrages, and he kind of likes it, right? So to get at your bigger question, what does this tell us? I think in the case of Johnson, he was seriously committed to these laws, but he was pretty suspicious about activists and about whether they were going to turn on him, whether they were going to support him. He wanted to have mechanisms for managing all of this grassroots ferment, and not unreasonably, because actually in the end, it is really left-wing protest that brings Lyndon Johnson down. And it's really the reason that he decides not to run again in 1968. Now, that doesn't mean it's a good idea to let the FBI do all your spying for you.
Right.
But they were real concerns, and he was just very suspicious of the left. He was very suspicious of young people. He was very suspicious of activists in general as having their own agenda that might not be Lyndon Johnson's agenda.
Wow. This is so interesting. We're coming towards the end of our time. I have to say, one of the things that struck me so much about hearing you talk today and reading the book is it's broadened my understanding of a potential use of biography as a genre, because of course this book is clearly about J. Edgar Hoover, but as you've said before and as I'm hearing you say now, it's such a window into broader stories that are not about J. Edgar Hoover, right? He's sort of the vehicle, if you will, for broader storytelling about things happening in this country, or he's sort of the lens with which we look through it from, but it's not always really about him in a very ironic way, right? It's actually about larger things happening in the context in which they exist, which I think is a very fascinating way to think about the genre. Before we depart, I have to ask you three questions from our students here at Vassar regarding your work. The first is, I'm going to paraphrase it a little bit, but the first is, now that you've done this massive biography on J. Edgar Hoover, and you have this experience doing biography in such a robust way, who would you write a biography on next if you had the chance to do so?
Well, I have actually agreed to write another.
Wonderful.
I am writing a short book first that is not a biography, that's not going to, leave me for a decade sitting alone with a bunch of research. But the next figure I'm going to take on is Ronald Reagan, who is actually quite similar in certain ways to Hoover in the scope of his life, his significance, and in the particular kind of role that he plays in the development of conservative politics.
Super interesting. The next question is about the book in particular, and in effect, the question is asking, which case or story did you not give much real estate to in the book that you wish you would have fleshed out more?
Well, it's funny, the two big stories that have become blockbuster films about the FBI in the last year during the Hoover era, one is the Oppenheimer case.
Right.
The other is the Killers of the Flower Moon, the Osage Indian investigations. Both of those I didn't give a whole lot of time to in the book, in part because there already were very admirable and well-established books about those things. In part because, though Hoover played a role, they weren't as essential to his development as they might have been. And I would say, in general, I can really nerd out on the big communist cases of the 40s and 50s, but I did understand that probably the desire of the broader public to go back into the details of the Alger Hiss case was more limited than my own.
Less
so
than yours.
Yeah, I restrained myself.
That's helpful. And the third question is, I can't remember what. Oh, did this project make you? Oh, this is a funny question. They're asking in effect, did this project make you more comfortable or less comfortable with I guess, your personal relationship to, or like thinking about the federal government as an entity, having learned more about it through the eyes of J. Edgar Hoover?
In a funny way, though, I certainly don't come down on Hoover's side, and a lot of the book is devoted to his misdeeds. I came out with a little more admiration for federal work, in the sense that, Hoover really is a product of the same moment that produces Social Security and the Wagner Act, right? The kind of New Deal moment. And I think particularly in the Trump years, you can see the value of a powerful, professional, fact-finding, administrative state that's a little bit outside of the political drama. The FBI has had a very difficult history in trying to draw those lines. They often haven't drawn it effectively. They've done lots and lots of terrible things. But I think in our own moment, when kind of the nobility of that vision of government service is under so much stress, to be able to go back to the early 20th century, see that idea emerge, see how many people believed in it and cared about it, was really powerful to me, and is something that I think, that FBI might not be the best example through which to revisit that, but for my own personal experience, that was very meaningful.
That's super helpful, and not to be too corny, but of course, as you said, sort of it was hard for the FBI to sort of draw these appropriate lines. But of course, the truth is these lines sort of probably always move, and they're probably not always straight anyway, right? They're sort of these really amorphous, jagged sort of salt lines, if you will. And we have to sort of figure out how we can sort of exist there and tolerate some level of discomfort on either end. But we're never going to sort of be perfect, right? We're always sort of straddling, if you will. So the act of straddling is sort of the act of existing with success, if you will, and some might argue. Bev, it's been so exciting talking to you today. Your work is so inspiring, and I hope for those who have listened that you will go out and buy the book and read it in totality, because it is a really high momentum, high adrenaline sort of storytelling mosaic, if you will. And I'm just so grateful that you shared some time with us today here on the podcast.
Thanks. I really enjoyed it.
Wonderful. Thank you all for listening, and we'll see you next time at the Salt Line. Have a great day.